As Bruno, a German Shepherd canine, walked slowly into the dimly lighted corridor of the police station, the rain poured down brutally, drowning everything in its path. His dark fur was dripping with water, and it dripped down the chilly floor, leaving behind trails that mirrored the flickering overhead lights. Bruno was a German Shepherd. At the end of the corridor, Jake Runn, his longtime handler and closest partner, stood frozen. His gaze remained fixed on the floor, avoiding the loyal eyes that had stood there. A thick bandage was wrapped tightly around his hind leg, and it was a wound that would never fully heal. This was the price that he had to pay for a misstep that occurred during a routine training drill. Bruno, who had been by his side for the previous 6 years, was perplexed as to why Jake had not been reaching out to him. Where were the reassuring pats and the gentle words of encouragement after such a long mission? What had he done wrong? We can't keep him because he's too much of a problem for the department, and we can't afford to keep him since he's only a dog, the muffled murmurs that floated from the offices behind closed doors during that night. Jake took Bruno to his car, as the leash jingled softly. Each statement wounded harder than any physical wound that could ever have been caused. As he unhooked it, they drove in silence through streets that were known to them, but this time there was no mission ahead of them. Finally, the car came to a halt on a road that was completely vacant and surrounded by open fields that went on forever. Jake opened the door, but this was not the typical signal for Bruno to immediately take action. Instead, he hesitated, clenching his grip on the steering wheel tightly, and then reached down to unclasp Bruno's collar. For a brief moment their eyes met, and Bruno saw something in Jake that he had never seen before: shame. There was no words, no farewell, just silence. After turning around, Jake got back into the car and drove off. Confusion and grief engulfed Bruno as he remained there motionless, watching the tail lights go into the darkness of the night. Sinking deep into his chest, he had been abandoned. Bruno stood motionless on the deserted road, staring into the darkness where Jake's car had vanished. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any storm. His canine instincts told him to wait. For years, he had been trained to stay in position until given a command, but this time there was no command, no signal, no voice calling him back. Now he was completely alone, but he couldn't stay here forever. The instincts that had once guided him through the most dangerous missions told him that waiting wouldn't change anything. Jake wasn't coming back, and so Bruno took a deep breath, shook the lingering raindrops from his fur, and began to walk. The first night was the hardest as the first rays of dawn illuminated the sky. Bruno curled up on the cold, unforgiving ground, his damaged leg throbbing with anguish. The stars above him twinkled indifferently, bringing neither warmth nor comfort. The horizon in question. Bruno took a deep breath and brushed off the leftover rains that were sticking to his fur. Every step delivered a searing agony through his damaged leg, but he had no choice but to continue waiting. He knew that waiting would not bring Jake back. There was no other option. The only thing that mattered at this point was to survive, and the days that followed were a relentless test of endurance. Once he had lived a structured life, with meals scheduled, missions assigned, and clear objectives, hunger became a constant ache for Bruno. Now, everything was uncertain, and every decision was his alone. However, deep within him, he knew one thing: his journey wasn't over. There was still some purpose waiting for him out there, and he had to keep moving. Bruno wandered through dirt paths, past desolate fields, and through dense forests, looking for food and water. Bruno walked through the small alleys, fatigued but ever vigilant. Since the day he had been abandoned, he had learned how to live, but nothing could replace the feeling of having a purpose. There was nothing that could replace the feeling of having a purpose as the sky became darker. When Bruno came to stop in front of a humble house with a large yard, there was no fence around it. All that was there was a towering oak tree. While standing tall in the corner, warm light poured out of the windows, and the sound of a child's sweet laughing could be heard in the background. During the yard, Bruno raised his head, and his ears began to quiver. Oliver, a young bear who was just beginning to learn how to walk, was sitting on a small blanket. His wide eyes were filled with wonder as he reached for the leaves that were falling. His mother Sophie was busy doing laundry, occasionally glancing over at her son Bruno, who watched them for a considerable amount of time. Bruno did not know why, but something about this location seemed to be different. His impulses to defend him began to awaken without making a sound. At the same time as he resumed his stealthy vigil, Bruno strolled to the foot of the oak tree and settled himself down. Even though his damaged legs were still throbbing, he felt a sense of familiarity within him. The feeling of having a mission once more. In the days that followed the event during his time with the Harper family, Bruno became a quiet shadow, and he learnt their routines. The briefcase was in Daniel's possession as he left for work early. Sophie handling the responsibilities of the family, while also taking care of Oliver, who is always interested and eager to explore the world with boundless energy. Bruno never got too close. He knew he was just a nameless stray, but that didn't stop his instincts. He had to protect this child. Slowly, he noticed something concerning though Sophie loved her son dearly. She was often distracted by her phone, by housework, by the endless demands of daily life, and Oliver, with his adventurous nature, was left unattended more often than was safe. Brew never made a decision, even if they never knew. He was there, he would be their silent guardian. He had found a reason to keep going. Days passed, and for the first time in a long while, Bruno felt something close to peace. The Harper home had become a beacon of warmth, and even from a distance, he found comfort in watching over them. It almost felt like he belonged, but peace never lasts forever. One afternoon, a strange car appeared. Bruno noticed it immediately, a black SUV moving slowly down the street, paying briefly in front of the Harper house before continuing on. The first time Bruno simply observed. The second time, he grew wary. By the third time, his canine instincts screamed danger. Two men sat inside, both wore sunglasses, their eyes darting toward the house with quiet intent. Bruno let out a low growl, but remained hidden. He had seen men like this before, back when he was still in service. He knew the look of criminals casing a target. The SUV came to stop across the street. The two men stepped out, glancing around before making their way toward the front porch. Inside the house, Sophie was busy cooking, ignorant of the oncoming threat. Oliver proceeded to play in the yard, completely oblivious to the situation. Bruno was aware that he needed to take action at this moment. He emerged from the shadows with a bark that was piercing, authoritative, and full of power. It was the exact sound that had previously caused criminals to be terrified during his time in the military. The two men froze. On his way out of his hiding location, Bruno appeared. Standing up in spite of the persistent agony in his knee, his fur bristled, and his concentrated stare was fixed on the intruders. One of them said something to the other, and they shared a glance before swiftly departing. The SUV roared to life and drove off down the street, and Sophie was startled by the sound. She stopped, her eyes lingering on the enigmatic dog, who was he had been there for days, constantly watching. The barking hurried outdoors, but all she saw was Oliver chuckling and Bruno calmly returning to his seat beneath the oak tree. She was very perplexed. Always present, and now he had just protected them from what exactly? Sophie's heart pounded as she glanced at Oliver, then back at Bruno. There was something about this dog, something she couldn't quite understand, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of him anymore. Bruno didn't need thanks, he just needed to know his family was safe. He had seen the suspicious individuals lurking, and he had once pushed them away. But his instincts told him that this family needed protection at this point. Bruno no longer had any doubts about the fact that this family need was far from over, and then the worst thing that could have happened occurred that afternoon. Sophie was busy in the kitchen, speaking hurriedly on the phone, and she didn't notice Oliver, as he always does, crawling further away, closer and closer to the pool. Bruno was watching from his usual spot, watching a light. There was a breeze that was blowing over the lake, and the sunshine was bouncing off the surface in different patterns. Bruno straightened every fiber of his body as he realized that something was awry. Oliver was entranced, and he inched nearer with his small fingers, reaching out to touch the shimmering light. Bruno jumped into action without delay, launching himself forward despite the stinging agony in his damaged leg. His muscular form sliced through the air before plunging into the water with a loud splash. Oliver leaned too far, lost his balance, and plummeted in Bruno's direction. Despite the fact that Oliver was flailing his little arm and slamming it on the surface in a state of terror, Bruno had prepared himself for this very moment. Memories of rescue drills from the past were replaced by instinct. After jumping into rivers in order to save people, the canine that was dormant within him became active. Within a few seconds, he reached Oliver and gently grabbed onto the child's wet clothing. Despite the fact that Oliver thrashed Bruno, he kept stable and continued swimming toward the shore with exact motions that he had perfected. At that very moment, Oliver let out a piercing shriek as his head breached the surface of the water. The moment Sophie stepped outside, she let out a scream of pure terror while clutching her chest. She saw her son drenched and trembling next to a stray dog. Then, she realized that Bruno was not just a nameless stray or a forgotten dog. He had just saved her son's life. Tears streamed down her face as she pulled Oliver into her arms and held him tightly. She turned to Bruno, breathless, with a mixture of shock, gratitude, and disbelief. Within her eyes, Bruno, who was fatigued but still awake, took a step back as if he was waiting to see her reaction. She gazed at him for a considerable amount of time, and then Sophie whispered his name for the very first time. Sophie stood frozen, clutching Oliver tightly, her heart still pounding from the terrifying ordeal. She looked at Bruno, soaking wet, panting heavily, yet his sharp eyes remained locked onto hers, as if awaiting a command for the first time. She didn't see Bruno as just a stray dog. He was a hero. Without hesitation, Sophie rushed Oliver inside, wrapping him in a warm towel, checking for any signs of injury. Her hands trembled as the realization sank in. Just 1 second later, just one moment without Bruno, the thoughts sent chills down on her spine. Once Oliver was safe, she turned back to the window, searching for the dog that had saved her son. A chilly breeze blew through the yard, and Bruno shivered, not only from the cold, but also from exhaustion. Bruno was still there. He hadn't left yet, and he hadn't moved closer either. He stood motionless, waiting to see if he would be accepted or whether he would be rejected once more. Slowly, Sophie stepped outside, and as she approached him, her gaze fixed on his deep, unwavering eyes. The fear that she had previously experienced had vanished, and she spoke in a soft, no longer wary tone. Bruno didn't move right away. He looked at Sophie, then at Oliver, who was reaching out from his mother's arms, his wide eyes filled with excitement. A moment passed, then, with hesitant steps, Bruno moved forward, crossing the threshold for the first time in what felt like forever. He was no longer abandoned. He had found a home. Bruno had found a home, but his duty was far from over. In the days following Oliver's rescue, the Harper family grew accustomed to Bruno's presence, Oliver especially adored his new four-legged guardian, constantly reaching out to hug him. This night, Bruno was sleeping near the front door when he was jolted awake by a strange noise. The noise was so soft that it was almost imperceptible, but to a trained canine, it was a warning sign. Sophie was still adjusting to the changes, but she knew in her heart that Bruno was now a member of their family. However, just as Bruno was beginning to accept this newfound peace, the nightmare came back. It's Bruno. As he neared the window of the living room, he heard the faint sound of footfall on gravel, and a deep growl rumbled in his throat. He rose to his feet and moved stealthily through the house. His ears pricked up, and his muscles tightened up. Even though it was quite dark, Bruno was able to make out the silhouettes of two intruders who were the identical individuals who had been in the black SUV from earlier. Bruno lunged toward the window and yelled with such force that the sound reverberated throughout the neighborhood inside. Without hesitation, one of them reached into his pocket glass and shattered it. Daniel pushed himself out of bed. Sophie grabbed Oliver. Now, he dashed to the dresser, grabbing his phone to call the police, while Bruno stood firm, fur-bristling eyes locked onto the INTRS. The burglars froze. They hadn't expected to face a former K-9 fully prepared to fight. As porch lights flickered on across the neighborhood, and the distant wail of sirens pierced the night, they realized their plan had failed. They turned to flee, but it was too late. Police cars screeched to a halt, blocking the SUV as it tried to speed away. Within seconds, officers had the intruders tied down and shackled back at the home. Bruno stayed at his station, keeping guard before his family. Suddenly, Sophie collapsed to her knees, clinging to Oliver with all her might, tears of relief streaming down her features. Bruno saw Daniel turn to him. His eyes were full with appreciation, and he didn't believe he needed to say anything, since he was certain that Bruno was the best possible defender for his family. People in the area were astonished not by the attempted break-in itself, but rather by the person who had prevented it from happening. The story of the attempted break-in traveled fast around the neighborhood. The officers who arrived at the scene immediately recognized Bruno, and some of them had worked alongside him in the past. They couldn't believe that the legendary kind they had once admired was standing in front of them, even though he was no longer wearing a badge, but he was still protecting and serving. One officer quietly stepped away, pulled out his phone, and made a call. The next morning, a police cruiser came up in front of the Harper residence. When the door opened, Jake Reynolds stepped out. He had heard about Bruno. He had heard about how he saved a child from drowning. He had heard about how he faced down criminals alone. And now, standing here, he had so much to say, but no idea how to begin. Bruno saw Jake. He didn't bark, he didn't growl, but he also didn't run to him like a dog excited to see his owner. He simply stood still, watching. "I'm sorry." Jake's voice was raspy with emotion as he pulled something little and shiny out of his pocket. It was Bruno's service medal, the one that should have never been taken away from him. Jake took a hesitant step forward, and then crouched down, meeting the gaze of the companion he had temporarily abandoned. Daniel and Sophie stood nearby, silently witnessing the moment. They didn't speak. This was something only Jake and Bruno could understand. Bruno looked at the medal, then back up at Jake. A long silence stretched between them. And then, for the first time in months, Bruno stepped forward, and gently pressed his head into Jake's hand. Jake exhaled sharply, his eyes shutting for a brief moment. Bruno had forgiven him, but more importantly, he had found the home he truly belonged to. Jake sat down beside Bruno, running a hand through his thick fur. You never stopped being a warrior, Bruno. You never gave up on your duty. Daniel watched the scene unfold, and then turned to Sophie and said, "I think we need to do something for him." Sophie nodded, and they reached out to the police department, contacted animal welfare organizations, and within a few weeks, Bruno's story spread throughout the city. The police department launched a program called the Bruno Initiative, which is dedicated to ensuring that retired K-9 officers are never abandoned again. Despite the fact that Bruno had not only found a place to call home, but had also become a symbol of second chances, the only thing that truly mattered to him was doing what he had always done best, which was defending the people he loved.